after 43 years of showing up every single day, my stepchildren looked me in the eye and told me I was never family. The moment my wife's coffin was in the ground, they handed me a sealed envelope and said the words I will carry to my grave. You were the help, Malcolm. Paid help. Now, collect your things and go. I stood in the hallway of the home I had maintained, repaired, and loved for 4 decades, holding that envelope like a man holds a verdict he already knew was coming, but prayed would never arrive. Inside was no check, no letter of thanks, only a small brass key on a worn leather cord, with a hand-scratched tag that read 3 words. Kaipara, the old shed. They laughed. My wife's eldest son, Darren, actually laughed. He told me to enjoy retirement in whatever caravan park would have me, then turned back to the solicitor as if I had already ceased to exist. Hello and welcome. Before we go any further, I want you to know this is a story about what loyalty looks like when no one is watching. It is a story about a woman I did not fully understand until she was gone. My name is Malcolm Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I spent my working life as a maritime surveyor on the Kaipara Harbour. And I know better than most that the structures we trust most completely are the ones whose foundations we never think to inspect. This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes, but the truths inside it are ones I hope stay with you long after the final word. My wife's name was Carolyn Tate. She was 54 when we met at a maritime industry dinner in Auckland in 1997. A biotech executive with silver-streaked hair and a handshake that meant business. I was 41, recently widowed, with calloused hands and a way of looking at things that my colleagues called thorough and my friends called exhausting. Carolyn called it exactly what she needed. She had 4 children from her first marriage. Darren was the eldest at 28, a property developer who wore his confidence like a coat, 2 sizes too big. Beside him was his sister Fiona, 26, who worked in corporate law and had her mother's eyes but none of her warmth. Then came Mitchell, 23, restless and reckless with money in the way only the comfortable can afford to be. And finally Jade, the youngest at 21, who studied hotel management and treated every room she entered like a resort she was quietly raiding. They were polite to me at first. Civil, in the way people are civil to tradespeople, acknowledging your presence while making clear you have no permanent claim to the space. Carolyn and I married in 1999 at a small ceremony in Lee. Her children attended. They smiled in the photographs. That was the last time I remember all 4 of them looking at me without calculation behind their eyes. I will not lie to you and say I never noticed the coldness that settled over Carolyn in the years that followed. She stopped holding my hand at family dinners around 2002. She began referring to household decisions as her decisions. She would forget to mention gatherings until they were over, and when I raised it, she would look at me with a flatness that felt like a door quietly closing. I asked her once, in the kitchen of our Remuera home on a Wednesday evening that smelled of rain and cold tile, whether she still wanted me there. She said, without turning from the bench, that I was free to leave whenever I chose. I stayed. People ask me why, and I understand why they ask. A man with self-respect should have walked. But when you love someone, truly love them, the way you love a structure you have spent years learning, you do not abandon it at the first sign of stress. You inspect it more carefully. You look for the reason the crack appeared. You assume, perhaps foolishly, that the foundation is still sound. What I did not know was that Carolyn had her own reasons for building that wall between us. I would not understand those reasons until I stood inside a corrugated iron shed on a block of Kaipara Harbour land I had never visited, holding the other half of a marriage I thought I had lost. The solicitor's office was in Parnell. His name was Douglas Fairweather, a compact man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Carolyn's 4 children sat in a row on one side of the long table. Darren in a blazer, Fiona with a leather folder already open, Mitchell with one knee bouncing, Jade scrolling her phone beneath the table's edge. I sat alone on the other side. Douglas read the will with the pacing of a man who had rehearsed it. Carolyn's estate, valued at approximately $9 million, was to be distributed equally among her 4 children. Her shares in the family biotech trust, the Remuera property, the investment portfolio, all of it carved cleanly into 4 portions. My name appeared once, near the end. A single clause noting that my contribution to the household had been adequately recognized during the course of the marriage, and that no further claim on the estate was warranted. Adequate recognition, 23 years. Gone, in a subordinate clause. Darren leaned back in his chair and said, without looking at me, that it was probably time I started thinking about downsizing. Fiona slid a printed list across the table. Items in the Remuera house she would require vacated within 14 days. Mitchell said nothing but smiled at his phone. Jade did not look up at all. Douglas cleared his throat and told me there was one additional item. He slid a small envelope across the table. My name was on the front in Carolyn's handwriting, the careful, upright script I had watched fill birthday cards and legal documents and shopping lists for 2 decades. Inside was the key, and the tag with 3 words. Darren told me not to get sentimental about whatever was in that shed. He said his mother had mentioned it was old equipment from a former business interest, probably worth nothing. He told me I was welcome to whatever rubbish was inside, and that he would expect the house keys on the kitchen bench by Friday. I drove north alone. I took State Highway 16 out of Auckland in the early morning, the Waitemata gray and flat to my right, the road cutting through farmland that slowly gave way to coastal scrub. The key sat in the cup holder beside me. I turned it over at every red light the way you turn over a problem you cannot yet solve. Kaipara was a harbor I knew professionally. Deep tidal channels, shifting sandbars, the kind of water that required respect. Carolyn had never mentioned owning land there. Not once in 23 years. I had been trying to reach her throughout her illness over the past 18 months. She had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the winter of 2020. And from the day her children found out, my access to her had narrowed steadily, like a doorway being slowly bricked up. By the final months, I was permitted 30-minute visits with at least 1 child present. Darren had told the hospital staff I was not immediate family, which, legally, was untrue. We were still married. But the energy required to fight it while watching the woman I loved diminish had been beyond me. She had slipped me a note 3 weeks before she died. Jade had been checking her phone, and Carolyn pressed a folded square of paper into my palm and held my hand over it. The note said only, Kaipara, the old shed. Trust me one more time, Mal. I had not known what to do with those words until Douglas handed me the key. I found the property by following a paper trail Carolyn had tucked inside the envelope beneath the key. A handwritten address and a sketch map that showed a driveway off an unmarked road. The land was 14 acres of coastal grass and regenerating bush above the Kaipara Harbour. At the end of a twin rut track stood a large corrugated iron shed, newer than it looked from the road, with a heavy padlock that the brass key turned without resistance. Inside, I stopped breathing. It was not a storage shed. It was a workspace, clean and dry and deliberate. One long wall was fitted with wooden shelving, and on those shelves sat rows of matching green folders labeled by year, beginning in 2002. Beside them stood a timber workbench with a laptop, a wireless router connected to a solar battery pack, and an envelope sealed in wax, my name on the front in the same careful script. On the opposite wall hung photographs, dozens of them. Me, at the harbor. Me, in the garden at Remuera. Me, at my desk on a Sunday morning with tea. A photograph taken from a distance of me and Carolyn laughing at something in 2004. In a year, I had already decided she no longer wanted me there. She had been watching. She had been recording a life she pretended, in front of her children, not to value. I sat down on a wooden stool and broke the wax seal. The letter was long, 11 pages in Carolyn's handwriting, the ink sometimes steady and sometimes not, depending, I realized, on which months of her illness had produced which pages. She had written it across the final year of her life, adding to it in pieces. She began not with an apology but with a fact. In June 2002, 3 years into our marriage, she had come home early from a conference in Wellington. She had walked in through the back door of the Remuera house to hear Darren on the phone in the study. He was 23 then, and already managing a portion of the family trust, telling someone that the situation with the surveyor needed to be resolved before the next dividend cycle. He was not talking about a professional surveyor. He was talking about me. She stood in the hallway and listened. Darren was speaking to her own father, a man I had always found formally pleasant and fundamentally empty. They were discussing having me assessed for a cognitive impairment that did not exist. Darren had already identified a private clinic in Hamilton that specialized in, as he put it, managing difficult domestic situations involving elderly or inconvenient spouses. I was 46. I was not elderly. I was inconvenient. Her father's voice on the other end of the phone was calm and encouraging. He reminded Darren that Carolyn's trust structure gave her children significant leverage if a spouse could be demonstrated to be incapacitated. He had been the one to build that leverage into the documents, years before I existed, as a safeguard against exactly this kind of complication. Carolyn did not confront them. She understood, in the way that strategically intelligent people understand things, that confronting them would only accelerate what they were planning. If they knew she was aware, they would move faster. They would find another method. So she made a decision that cost her every day of the next 21 years. She built a wall between herself and me, a performance of indifference so consistent and so convincing that her children stopped worrying about her loyalties and focused instead on their inheritance timelines. By doing so, she became the one thing they had not anticipated, the architect of their ruin. The letter described what followed in the methodical way she approached every problem. She had found a maritime lawyer in Wellington, not Auckland, where her family's connections ran deep and began, quietly, transferring certain assets into structures her children could not easily reach. The Kaipara land was the first. She purchased it in 2003 under a company name that bore no connection to the Tate Family Trust. She deeded it to me in 2005. I had owned 14 acres of Kaipara land for 18 years without knowing it. I set the letter down and looked at the shelf of green folders. 21 years of green folders, one for each year from 2002 to the end. I stood up and pulled the first one from the shelf. She had kept records of everything. There was a folder for 2004 inches, which she had documented the first attempt to have my professional reputation undermined. Darren had contacted the Maritime New Zealand Licensing Authority with an anonymous complaint about my surveying conduct on a Kaipara Harbour project. The complaint was vague professional negligence, procedural shortcuts, the kind of allegation that costs nothing to make and a great deal to defend. Carolyn had discovered it through a contact in the ministry and had engaged her own legal team to monitor the file. The complaint was withdrawn 6 weeks later. I had never known it existed. I remember 2004. I remember feeling, that year, a particular variety of professional unease, the sense that I was being assessed somehow, that my standing was less secure than it appeared. I had attributed it to the normal anxieties of middle age. I had not known that my stepson was making phone calls designed to dismantle the career that gave me my independence. The 2007 folder was heavier. I opened it slowly. I recognized the incident immediately. November 2007. I had been driving home from a surveying job in Northland on a Thursday evening when the brakes on my Land Rover had gone not gradually, as brakes fail with wear, as brakes fail when a line has been cut. I had managed to steer into a gravel bank at the side of the road and walked away with a bruised sternum and a shaken certainty about my own mortality. The police report at the time was inconclusive. The Land Rover was old. Brake failure happened. Except, as the 2007 folder made clear, it did not just happen. Carolyn had hired a private mechanic, independent of the police investigation, who examined the vehicle and produced a written report. The brake line had been cleanly severed, not frayed, not corroded, cut. The report sat in the folder beside a receipt showing Carolyn had paid to have the vehicle crushed immediately after the independent examination, destroying the evidence before Darren could discover that she had discovered him. She could not go to the police without tipping her hand. She could not confront Darren without triggering whatever contingency plan he had in reserve. So, she did what she always did. She documented it, filed it, and protected me in silence. In the months that followed, she sold my Land Rover. I had been furious about that. We had argued in the driveway. She had been immovable and bought me a newer model she had privately had inspected by 3 separate mechanics. I had experienced that argument as control. I now understood it as care. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before I could open the next folder. By 2011, according to the green folders, Carolyn's children had moved from physical risk to legal strategy. Fiona, now a senior associate at her firm, had begun drafting documents to challenge any future claim I might make on the estate. More urgently, she had begun advising Darren on a plan to have Carolyn's mental capacity assess the same tactic they had originally planned for me, now turned on the woman they were meant to love. If they could establish that Carolyn was not of sound mind, they could challenge her asset movements and trustees. Carolyn had been 3 steps ahead of them. She had been submitting to voluntary cognitive assessments since 2009, with a specialist in Takapuna who had no connection to the family. The reports were in the folder 23 assessments over 14 years, each one clinical, thorough, and definitively clear. She had spent 14 years building a paper fortress against her own children's ambitions. What broke something in me, sitting on that stool in the Kaipara shed, was the folder for 2013. Mitchell, the 3rd child, had apparently developed a more personal approach. He had befriended my GP, not overtly, there was nothing so crude as a bribe, but socially, through a shared interest in sailing, an introduction through a mutual club connection. Over 18 months, Mitchell had positioned himself as a concerned stepson worried about my health. He had suggested, in the casual way suggestions are made between friends over drinks, that I had been showing signs of cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion, poor judgment. My GP had not acted on it, but the suggestion had been planted, and Carolyn had discovered it through the same Wellington lawyer who monitored her affairs. The folder contained a letter from that lawyer, advising her of the contact, and a note in Carolyn's handwriting that said simply, she had, in the years following, very quietly ensured that my medical records were maintained by a different practice, one in Devonport, across the harbor, where Mitchell's social network did not reach. I closed the 2013 folder and pressed my hands against my knees. Outside the shed, I could hear the wind off the Kaipara and the sound of native birds in the scrub. It was an enormously peaceful sound for a moment that felt like the floor shifting beneath me. The question that had lived in the back of my throat for 20 years, why did she stay cold? Why did she pull away? Why did she let me believe I was alone? He was being answered folder by folder, in the voice of a woman who had loved me in absolute secrecy for 2 decades. I turned to the letter and kept reading. She explained the wording of the will in the same direct way she explained everything. The clause describing my contribution as adequately recognized during the marriage was Fiona's language. Fiona had drafted a version of the will that she believed Carolyn had signed. What Carolyn had actually signed was a different document, one that Douglas Fairweather held in a secondary file. The will read in his office was real and valid, but it was not complete. The Kaipara property, deeded to me since 2005, was not part of her estate. It was already mine. The company structure she had used held additional assets, a managed investment fund she had been building since 2003, worth, as of the most recent statement in the folder, just over $2 million. The fund was self-sustaining. It covered the land rates, maintenance costs, and provided a monthly income that would continue for the foreseeable future. They had taken $9 million. What they did not know was that they had inherited a liability. Carolyn's letter described the asset structure she had left them, with a precision that would have felt cold from anyone else. The majority of the estate's liquid value was tied to a biotech trust structured around performance thresholds that Carolyn had known for 3 years would not be met. The Remuera property had a covenant attached that had not been disclosed in the will, reading a heritage clause registered in 2018 that severely restricted any development or subdivision. The investment portfolio's largest single holding was in a company that Carolyn had privately known was under regulatory review. They had the sterling name she had written in the original story's words, except that this was Carolyn's version of it, and she wrote it differently. She said, "They took what they thought was the prize. What they actually took was the bill." When I reached the final pages of the letter, her handwriting had changed. Slower, more deliberate. She was writing in the last months of her illness, and the effort of it was visible in every stroke. She said she was sorry. Not for the decisions she had made, she stood by every one of them. She was sorry for every evening she had walked past the lounge where I was reading and not stopped. She was sorry for every family dinner where she had spoken over me, or not looked at me across the table when something funny was said. She was sorry for the version of our marriage that I had experienced, which she knew had felt like slow abandonment. She had not known another way to keep the wolves outside the door. She said she had come to the Kaipara property twice a year for 20 years. What she told the children were professional retreats, board strategy weekends, health consultations. She had come here, and she had kept the place, and she had written to me. Not letters she could send, letters she filed in green folders, dated and sealed. One for every significant thing she had wanted to say, and could not risk saying where her children might find evidence of her real feelings. 462 letters, written to a man who was reading them for the first time in a shed above a tidal harbor on a Thursday in the autumn of 2023. I did not sleep that night. I stayed in the shed with a sleeping bag I found in a storage box and read until the solar light dimmed. I read about our early years before 2002, which she described with an openness that felt almost unbearable. I read about the year she learned I had quietly been helping Jade with her university fees, from my own salary, not telling Carolyn, not making anything of it, just doing it because Jade had mentioned once that the costs were harder than she expected, and I had never been able to walk past a problem that had a straightforward solution. Carolyn had found out through a bank statement. She wrote that she had gone into the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes, and then dried her face and come out and never mentioned it, because she could not afford to let her children see her grateful to me. I had not known she knew. 3 days after I arrived at the Kaipara property, a hire car came up the track. Darren was in the passenger seat and Mitchell was driving. They parked short of the shed, and I watched them from the window before I went to the door. Darren looked different outside the solicitor's office. He looked like a man who had run a calculation that was not adding up. He had spoken to a property agent about the Remuera covenant. He had spoken to a financial advisor about the biotech trust performance projections. He had spoken, apparently, to Fiona, who had spent a week trying to locate the remaining assets and found a structure she did not recognize and could not access. He climbed out of the car and looked at the shed, then at me standing in the doorway. And the arrogance that had been so complete and so effortless in the solicitor's office was now carrying visible cracks. He said they had come to talk about the property. I stepped back and let them in. I had spent the previous 2 days arranging the shed the way Carolyn would have arranged it methodically, with purpose. The green folders were stacked on the workbench in chronological order. The laptop was open. The independent mechanics report from 2007 was on top, followed by the documents related to the anonymous professional complaint from 2004, followed by the records of the cognitive assessment campaign from 2011, followed by the GP contact from 2013. I did not speak at first. I let them look. Mitchell picked up the mechanics report. I watched the color change in his face, the way color changes in material under stress, not all at once, but progressively, from the outer edges in. Darren read the documents about the 2004 licensing complaint with the stillness of someone hoping that total stillness will somehow prevent consequences. I told them what Carolyn had known and when she had known it. I told them about the Wellington lawyer, the independent assessments, the asset structure they had not found, and the inheritance they had actually received, including its liabilities. I told them about the 462 letters. I told them that Douglas Fairweather held a sealed secondary file that would be opened in the event of any legal challenge to Carolyn's capacity or the validity of her estate arrangements, and that the contents of that file included everything in those green folders. Darren asked if I was going to the police. I told him that was not the first question a man who had done nothing wrong would ask. I told them that what happened next was a decision I had not yet made, and that the making of it would depend considerably on what they chose to do in the days that followed. I told them that the Kaipara property was mine, had been mine for 18 years, and that I would be staying. I told them that the estate they had inherited came with conditions and costs their mother had built in with considerable precision, and that navigating those conditions would require, among other things, my cooperation and goodwill, both of which they had spent 23 years treating as disposable. Mitchell sat down on the stool by the workbench. He did not look like a hedge fund manager or a property developer's brother. He looked like a man who had just understood, for the first time, the full weight of what he had participated in. He asked me, quietly, whether Carolyn had been scared of them. I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about a woman standing in a hallway in 2002, listening to her son and her father plan the removal of the man she loved. I thought about her coming to this shed twice a year, for 20 years to write letters she could not send. I thought about 2007 and a brake line and a vehicle she had crushed to protect me from finding out what her own child was capable of. I told him she had not been scared. I told him she had been heartbroken, that there was a significant difference, and that understanding it was probably the most important thing any of them could do now. Fiona arrived the following morning, alone. She sat at the workbench and read for 4 hours without speaking. When she finally looked up, her face had the expression of someone who has spent a career building arguments and has just read the one that defeats every argument she knows. She asked me what Carolyn had wanted. Not what the documents required, not what the legal structure permitted what Carolyn had wanted. I told her the answer was in the letters, all 462 of them, that Carolyn had not wanted to write a single one of them, that she had wanted, every day for 21 years, to simply live in a house with her husband and her children without it being a strategic exercise in survival. Fiona did not say anything for a long time after that. Jade came last. She drove herself, 3 days after Darren and Mitchell, and she brought nothing, no folders, no documents, no prepared position. She stood at the door of the shed in the morning light and looked at the wall of photographs, and something crossed her face that I recognized from a long time ago, from a girl of 21 who had, for a brief period, actually seemed to like me. She said she remembered that I used to fix things. She said she had not thought about that in a long time. She had come home from university once, in 2002, with a broken laptop. The hinge cracked, and I had repaired it over a weekend without being asked and left it on her desk. She said she had walked past that laptop for years without remembering where the repair had come from. I told her that her mother had known about the laptop, that Carolyn had written about it in the folder for that year, and what she had written was not complicated. She had written that she wished she could have thanked me out loud. Jade stood in the doorway for a long time. The Kaipara was visible behind her, the light off the water, the particular silver of a clear New Zealand morning. She said she was sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they want something, in the way they say it, when there is genuinely nothing left to want. And sorry is the only true thing remaining. There is no clean ending to a story like this. Life does not resolve itself in the way stories do, and I would not want you to think that a handful of conversations in a corrugated iron shed repaired 23 years of harm. It did not. Harm that runs that deep leaves geological marks. You can trace the layers if you press your hand against the wall. What I can tell you is what the following year looked like. Darren engaged with the estate's legal and financial complications in the way a professional engages with a technical problem methodically, with the particular concentration of someone who understands at last that the system is more sophisticated than he is. He did not apologize directly, but he came to the Kaipara property 6 times in that year, and on the 5th visit, he brought his own son, a boy of 9, who asked me what I used when I surveyed a harbor. I spent an hour explaining tide tables, and he asked very good questions. Fiona redirected her professional skills toward a pro bono practice she had not previously considered: estate planning for older New Zealanders without the resources to protect themselves from exactly the kind of family pressure she had once applied. I found out about it not from her but from Douglas Fairweather, who mentioned it in passing. I thought about what Carolyn would have made of that. I think she would have been characteristically unsurprised. Mitchell took longer. The work of becoming honest is harder for people who have built a career on the opposite habit, and Mitchell's road was not straight. But he came to a point, somewhere in the winter of that year, where he called me on a Sunday evening for no particular reason and talked for an hour about a coastal property he was considering, and asked whether I thought the foundation soil profile looked stable. It was the first time he had ever asked my professional opinion on anything. I gave it honestly, and he thanked me. Jade comes to the Kaipara now when she needs to think. She tends the garden that Carolyn had planted. I had not even known there was a garden until I found the plans in a folder for 2015, and then I had spent a weekend clearing the growth back and found it still there, a little wild, but surviving. I did not turn any of them over to the police. That decision took me a long time, and I will not pretend it was uncomplicated. What I arrived at, eventually, was the understanding that Carolyn had built this entire structure not to punish her children, but to produce a particular outcome, one in which I was protected, they were held accountable, and the possibility of something better remained open. Handing the documents to a prosecutor would have ended one chapter cleanly and closed every subsequent one. That was not what Carolyn's 462 letters were building toward. I keep the letters in the green folders on the shelf in the shed. I have read them all now, more than once. I have read the ones from the early years when her handwriting was fast and the ones from the final months when it was slow. I have read the ones where she was angry at herself, and the ones where she was, despite everything, quietly satisfied with the architecture she was building. I have read the one she wrote on the anniversary of our wedding every year without fail, which said the same thing at the end, every time, without variation. I chose well, Mal. I would choose the same. I walked to the edge of the Kaipara property on clear evenings and watched the light change over the water. The harbor has a particular quality at that hour, the channels catching the last of the sun, the sandbars going dark, the whole geometry of it shifting with the tide in a way that rewards patience and punishes certainty. I spent my career learning to read water like that. I should have known that the woman I married was made of the same material. If I could reach back to the man standing in that solicitor's office holding a brass key, I would tell him this. The silence of someone who loves you is not the same as indifference. People protect the things they value in the language available to them. And sometimes that language is a wall and a locked shed and 462 letters that were never meant to be sent. Do not confuse a fortress with an absence. Do not confuse strategy with coldness. And do not, under any circumstances, assume that because someone cannot show you their love safely, they are not holding it with both hands in the dark. A structure is only as honest as its inspection. We spend so much of our lives inspecting the surfaces, the gestures, the expressions, the things people say in rooms where others are listening, and we miss the foundations entirely. The foundations are where the truth lives. They are unglamorous and invisible, and they hold everything up. Carolyn held everything up. For 21 years, in complete silence, she held everything up. I walk back to the shed in the evening. I make a cup of tea on the small gas hob and I sit at the workbench where she sat. And sometimes I talk to the empty room the way you talk to someone, when the talking is the point, not the answer. The Kaipara moves outside. The birds settle in the scrub. I chose well too, I tell her. I would choose the same. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If anything here has reached you, whether it is the cost of silence, or the quiet ways love can be present when it appears absent, or simply the question of what we owe the people who stay, I would be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. This story is fictional, but the truths inside it are not. And if you are someone who feels unseen right now, in a family or a home where your presence seems to go unrecorded, please remember this. Being unacknowledged and being unvalued are not the same thing. Sometimes the people who love us most are doing so in a language we have not yet learned to read. Keep looking. The letters are there.